Hey guys, this is a quick scientific background to the Hesperidin study that was announced earlier today. Essentially, the anticipated activity of Hesperidin are to prevent the entry of the coronavirus inside the cells. And if they are inside those cells, the anticipation is that Hesperidin can block essentially the replication process. And finally, there's scientific evidence that Hesperidin is able to modulate what's referred to as cytokine storms, or more precisely, the modulation of inflammatory mediators. This is a typical progression of a COVID-19. So once you're infected, there are really two outcomes post-incubation, whether you have no symptoms, which is great, but if you do have symptoms, those symptoms are referred to as the day one of the onset of the disease. And for the next 7 days, there's a window of vulnerability. That's the time it takes for the body to recognize the foreign agent and develop antibodies against it. That's also the reason why vaccines are so important. But within those 7 days, when you look at the typical progression post-symptoms, you're either doing fine, or typically by the seventh day, you may require hospitalization. And from the first week to the second week, you either stay within the ward or you're transferred to the ICU. And on average, unfortunately, 14 days after the onset of the disease is the typical window where people don't make it. So it's important within that 14 days window to try and prevent the entry of the virus as much as possible, try to prevent the replication, and try to modulate the cytokine storm. So the evidence that we've gathered are based on scientifically published literature, mainly in animal models, some computational modeling, some experimental evidence in the laboratory about the ability to inhibit the replication process. And you can see this in the more comprehensive slide deck that we have available. So in a nutshell, without getting into too many details, what's reported in literature is that Hesperidin is anticipated to block the spike protein of the virus. And it's reported by computational modeling that it would insert itself within the binding domain of the spike protein of the coronavirus and the ACE2 human receptor. In so doing, what Hesperidin is attempting to do is essentially block the entry of the virus within those cells. Now, the second reference is to the replication process. So what was reported was that one of the main protein responsible for the replication is referred to as 3CL-Pro. Now, Hesperidin has been reported and measured that it can inhibit this particular protein from replicating. And in so doing, Hesperidin is essentially the equivalent of a monkey wrench in the system, in the cogs, to try and prevent the infection process. Thirdly, and very importantly, there's ample literature regarding Hesperidin and its ability to modulate inflammatory mediators, especially cytokines. And you can see on the left-hand side that interleukin 6, IL-6, is a marker between survivors and non-survivors. And on the right-hand side, the marker of importance is cardiac troponin I, which is a very important marker at the Montreal Heart Institute. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing it with this institute. And when you look at it closely, if the levels of cardiac troponin I are higher than 28, there's an 80 to 1 likelihood of in-hospital death. And you can see that within the first 14 days, there's a progression of the cardiac troponin in COVID-19 patients. And the distinction between the two, as you see in the middle, is what's referred to as the cytokine storm. So it's very important to try and modulate this as best as possible in order to prevent essentially this from getting out of hand. And it is anticipated and reported in many animal models that Hesperidin has the potential to do so. And in doing that, Hesperidin here is trying to put a lid on any potential fire that may occur within the body of a patient that at that point is most likely hospitalized. So the objective is to reduce the symptoms, and by reducing the symptoms, there's a decrease in likelihood for COVID-19 patients to require hospitalization. So here is just a listing from 7 different papers that report the modulation of those inflammatory mediators. And these particular inflammatory mediators were selected based on a consortium group called the Recogram Consortium that essentially guided back in July which of those inflammatory mediators were key into a successful modulation of the inflammation in the COVID-19 patients. And we based our listing out of that consortium paper. So we'd like to thank the Montreal Heart Institute and all the healthcare workers on the front line of the coronavirus pandemic. Heartfelt thank you.